Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
We have quite a bit to cover today. I don't intend to turn you all into assessors, but just to give you an idea of the documents that are available to you from the International Organization for Standardization. If you are listening today, then you are most likely aware of a quality management system such as IT Service Management System or Information Security Management System, Business Continuity Management System, or Food Safety Management System. If you look at them, each one of them has the requirement for improvement based on ISO 9001. So I'm going to walk you through a process improvement method based on ISO standards in the 33,000 series. To do that, we need to understand a few things, such as what is a process. We need to be level set on a definition for process. As well, I will introduce you to what is called a process assessment model, which has a number of components to it. And we will also look at a process reference model. In fact, we'll talk about a few process reference models. So let's first look at a process. If you look at this, it's a fairly simple diagram where you see that the policy is where we define our outcomes and our objectives. And to support that, we have our standards. And engineering people understand this concept of a standard, but for people in business, we'll call them performance indicators. And we have to do some measurement of our activities and our inputs and our outputs to determine whether we're meeting standards. It's a fairly simple process. We have inputs, we have activities, and we have outputs. Now, by definition, if you have the best input and the best activities, then you have to have the best output. We can try to do quality assurance and inspection and all those things, but as Harold F. Dodge of the Bell Labs once said, you cannot inspect quality into a product. You have to build it in. So processes are everything you do in your organization can be considered a process or part of a process. And those processes are all characterized by average or mean performance and some variation around the mean. So we'll have it like through 6 plus or minus 2. So processes are performing optimally when the result of the process is within the expected value, meaning there is minimal variation. In Six Sigma, we consider minimal variations at 3.4 defects per million opportunity, because as they say, shift happens, so you can never get to 0 as processes wobble. Now, there are known problems with processes. Customers complain that the process costs too much, that they're not willing to pay for what the service of the product is. Maybe it takes too long. Some of you might have waited in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles and thought, wow, this is taking too long. Or sometimes you're getting what we'll refer to as a Cadillac solution, where there's a lot of gold plating, extra things are added on, when really we wanted something much simpler, faster, and cheaper. So why do products or services cost too much? Well, there are several reasons. One is that processes can contain hidden factories. Hidden factories are activities that reduce the quality or efficiency of a manufacturing or operation or business process. And they're not usually known to managers or other people until we start to do an improvement of the process. As well, we find that processes contain waste. In the Toyota production system, also known as Lean, we talk of 3 types of deviation from optimal allocation of resources. We have Muda, Mura, and Muri. Muda specifies 7 types of waste. An example of waste is storage or inventory. I don't know one customer who says, oh, by the way, please store my product for 30 days before you ship it to me. That's not generally what is required. Companies like Walmart understood this, and that is why they became wildly successful. Now, to start to look at this concept of process capability, we have to understand that there is process limits and tolerance limits. So the process itself will give off some data and give off some information that we call the voice of the process. So the first thing we're looking for is that we only have common cause variation. That means there's no erratic variation and that we only have common cause, which means we have a stable process. We cannot evaluate a process until it's stable. We have to bring it into stability before we can determine its capability. We also have the tolerance limits, which is the voice of the customer. The voice of the customer generally is expressed as something like a specifications, and we have upper specification limits and lower specification limits, and we want it to be somewhere within there. So a customer might say, I want a particular part that's 6 millimeter plus or minus 0.5 millimeters, and that would be a specification limit. So our process capability is a measure of how capable the process is to meet the requirements. So we compare the process limits to the tolerance limits. Perhaps some of you have heard of ISO 13053-1. It describes a methodology for business improvements known as Six Sigma. ISO 13053-2 specifies tools and techniques. In there, you will find CP and CPK, which are basically process capability indices. This definition that we see on this slide here is basically CP. If you're into calculating CP and CPK, I will show you very quickly how it fits into what I'm talking about today. So originally, ISO 15504 was known as SPICE, and you can see at the bottom of the slide that SPICE stands for Software Process Improvement and Capability Determination. So yes, it was a software development model, but you can see that it could apply to anything. We have a process, and the process is examined by a process assessment, which is what we're doing or talking about today. Now, we do a process assessment for one of two reasons. To do capability determinations, to say, you know, as they do in Bangalore, they say, I'm a CMMI level 5, so they can use that to sell against their competitors who are CMMI level 4. The process assessment could also be for process improvement. So process assessment leads to process improvement. Also, when we do our capability determination, we can also do process improvement. Process improvement identifies changes to the process that are required. And then the capability determinations identifies the capability and the risks of the process itself, and we'll touch on that on one of the latter slides. Now, our process assessment model, so we finished with our process, and we're moving on to a process assessment model. It has two dimensions. One dimension is the process entities, or the process dimension, and the other is the capability scale, or the capability dimension. So we'll see on the next slide these terms. We'll see our measurement framework and our process reference model. So another way of looking at it is depicted on this slide. At the top, we see our process assessment model, the PAM, and the PAM is made up of the process reference model. In the process reference model, we define domains and we define the scope of what we're talking about. For each process we define the purpose and the outcomes. For our measurement framework, we look to ISO 33002, and we get our capability levels. And we'll see later on that there's 0 to 6, and associated with 0 to 5, I should say 6 of them. And our capability levels have 9 process attributes. In addition, we have to rate each one, so we have to come up with a rating scale. So those things create our process assessment model, and also within that, we have to scope this assessment we're going to do. We're going to have some indicators. We might have to map, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We might have to translate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we have our PAM. That's the first thing we need because we have to do assessment based on something. But we also need an assessment process. And the assessment process is basically like a little mini audit, if you want. It in itself is a project. And you can see that we have the initial input, such as what is the purpose of this? Are we trying to do capability determination or process improvement? What is the scope? Is it this division, this department, this company? What is the scope of the assessment? And are there any constraints, such as Jim won't be here during September, so we can't do the assessment during September? And then any identities of people be involved in the approach, and then the competence of the assessors and any other things we might need. We'll go through the process, one of the latter slides, which is basically planning, collection, validation, rating, and then reporting. And then we have our outputs. So we're going to have a report. And there are going to be various roles and responsibilities in the assessment process. We'll have our assessors, and we'll have sponsors, and we'll have owners, and the rest, and we'll talk about this later. So here's our simple methodology we're going to talk about. And you can see it depicted here. If you're into information security, then you'll recognize ISO 27001. as requirements for information security management system. And you can see right below it, ISO 33004, which are the requirements for process reference models. So those two together give us 33,052 on the right, a process reference model for information security management. So now we have our process reference model. The next thing is we take 33,004, which says requirements for a process assessment model, a PAM, and then 33,002, which is a requirement for performing a process assessment. And they created a document called 33,072, which is a process assessment model for information security management. Now, feeding into that are the requirements for process measurement frameworks 33,003 and 33,020, which is a process measurement framework. So here we have a method for doing information security process capability assessments. Now notice that these two both have TS in their title. It means that they are not finalized as of yet, but when they are, then you'll have a similar model to what I'm demonstrating today to do information security. Now, so Barry Lewis and I decided to apply this to project management, not just IT projects, but all projects, whether they be building bridges or building buildings, all projects. You can see here again this concept of it being a two-dimensional process dimension and our capability dimension. On the left, we have our guidance on project management, which is ISO 21500. Now, this is version 2012. They are in the process of updating it and may soon have a version out in 2018, 2019. So this becomes our process reference model. We use the information in there, we format it in a different way, add some additional things, and we have a process reference model, which is available in the project management capability assessment document shown, the book in the middle. As well, we need our capability dimension, and you can see that 33,020 on the right-hand side says process measurement framework for assessment of process capability. So this becomes our measurement framework. So now we have a process reference model, we have a measurement framework, and the only other thing we need in the book in the middle is an assessment process itself. So you'll find that in there. So let's talk about some of the various PRMs that are out there. So some of you who are in IT might be familiar with COBIT and COBIT 5. In COBIT 5, there's a document called Process Assessment Model, PAM, using COBIT 5. As well, you can see the last one on the list is TUTOR, or TIPA, which stands for Tutor IT Service Management Process Assessment using ITIL. So this is the same methodology, except the one we're using COBIT and the other we're using ITIL. You can also see 33,071. So people are going to say, wow, this is software and this is IT related and all this. And you're right, it started out that way, but there's no reason why we cannot apply it to any type of process, whether it's HR, financial, any process is applicable. This process is applicable. So you see 33,071 is an integrated process capability assessment model for enterprise processes. So not just IT, this can be applied to anything. The only thing is you have to come up with a process reference model. Once you come up with a process reference model, then everything else is easily done. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk, as I said, about project management, which is ISO 21500 and the project management capability assessment. So using ISO 21500, Barry Lewis and I came up with the project reference model. And you can see here that it looks somewhat similar to ISO 21500, and it looks somewhat similar to PMBOK if you're familiar with those documents. And you'll recognize the processes within the management domain. There's two areas, governance and management. And the processes within the management area fall into the process groups. So each one of those domains, such as initiate, plan, implement, control, close, is a process group in PMBOK and ISO 21500. So to follow the model in the ISO series, we have areas, governance, and management. And we have domains. There's 7 of them, starting with establish and then ending with close. So there's 45 processes within those domains. Now, each one of those processes has several to many activities associated with them. In the terminology here, we use base practices. So we're looking for base practices. So base practices are the minimal. There might be additional practices that you might be carrying out, but we have to meet at least the base. So how many activities, how many base practices are? Well, let's look at an example, and I'll show you how it works, and you'll get an idea. So I took the first process from the first area, which is governance, and in the first domain, which is established. So we have the governance area that is established domain, and we have a process ID of ES01. Now, these are just random, but they sort of follow a logical flow, and the numbering is just the next up gives the next number. You see the process name. It says define and manage the project management framework. So there's a process name. So I'm going to have to define it, and then I'm going to have to manage it. You see a description, which is to clarify and maintain the governance framework. We see a purpose, provide a consistent project management approach. So we want something that's consistent, repeatable, and it has to be a project management, whereas we're dealing with project management. But the real purpose is to enable enterprise governance requirements to be met, covering project management processes, organizational structures, roles and responsibilities, that is reliable and repeatable activities and skills and competencies. So there's basically the background, the name, the description, the purpose. From the purpose, we derive the outcomes. So the outcomes, again, become what we call our lag indicators. So they could be measured if we wanted. We could have outcome measures. But our first outcome here is a project management framework is defined. So the outcome measure is pretty easy here. Either it's binary, either you have one or you don't. And a project management framework is followed. Well, you'd have to come up with something different, like the number of projects that follow the project management framework, and that'd be a percentage, and you set some target and hope to hit that. So in this first part, we have defined our process name, description, the purpose, and provided the outcomes. Now, each one of the 45 processes in the document has the same template, the same format. Obviously, the difference is in what's on the right-hand side. So the next thing you see is we come up with our base practices. So we started out this session with a quick description or a quick definition of a process. And we find it as inputs, activities, and outputs. So here we have our activities or base practices. And you could come up with performance indicators or lead indicators associated with each one of these base practices. So when I go in to do an assessment, I look to see, do you have a definition of project management? Do you have a framework for IT investments? Do you maintain an IT project management framework? Again, these are kind of binary things. Either you have a process that does that or you don't. And you establish a project management office. So there's some activities you need to do to meet the requirements of ES01 and to satisfy the objectives. So we have our activities, so we need our inputs and our outputs. On our next slide, we have our inputs. And you can see that our first input we need is a decision-making model. And we say it comes from outside of project management, from corporate governance. In that decision-making model, we can say, well, we want governance, we want management, and we want operation. The governance will be a project steering committee, management will be a project manager, and operations will be all the people who work on the project itself. So we'll set up some decision-making model and how things flow from management to governance, from governance to management, from management to operations, and operations back to management. As well, we'll set authority limits, and if we're talking about projects, then a lot of times we're setting limits for, say, project tolerance. Overall, the organization will have some appetite for risk, and then a risk tolerance will be set for projects, and that will be given to the project steering committee, which will in turn will allocate a certain amount of the risk appetite to each one of the projects in turn. As well, we see that we have some enterprise governance governing principles, overall things that come from corporate governance. And the last thing is a process architecture model. So how are we going to create our processes? Do we have a standard format for documenting them like I'm showing here? So again, how do we create and maintain processes themselves? So the last thing the next thing is the output. We'll get to the last. So the outputs, so we had our inputs and we have our activities, and then they're going to create some outputs. And the first thing we see, since this is developing the framework, the project management framework, is we come up with some project management guidelines, which will go to all processes. We also come up with a PMO charter, the Charter for the Project Management Office, and that will be available to all processes as well. We have a definition of organizational structure and functions, and that will go to all processes. And we have a definition of project-related roles and responsibilities. We have our process capability assessment methods and our assessments themselves. We have performance goals and metrics of process improvement tracking. So these are the outputs we'd expect to see from this particular process, this established process. The last thing we see are the references. The reason we provide the references is it's unlikely that every organization has processes that match exactly to the processes in our process reference model. So you're going to have to do some mapping and have to map them to your standard. And so we just provided, if you're using Prince2, then it's equivalent to Section 6. If you're using PM Box 6th edition, then it's equivalent to Section 1.4 and so on. So we give that so you can do some mapping, and this is useful when you start to do assessments in themselves and you're in initiation and planning. So now we have our process reference model. So we define that. So that's here. We have our process dimension. We have our 2 areas, governance and management. We have our 7 domains, starting with establish and going through to close. Within that, we have a number of processes. You see there's 3 for establish, 3 for monitor, and these add up to 45 different processes, and these 45 processes have many activities associated with them. So that's our process dimension. As well as to do our process assessment, we need a capability dimension, as mentioned earlier. So you see our capability dimension. I said earlier that it was from 0 to 6. I misspoke and we corrected and said it's from 0 to 5. So we're going to give some number. This is a nominal number, right? It's just you can't use it. You can't multiply level 3 times level 2 to get level 6. It's nominal. I can say I am level 3. So these levels each have names associated with them. Level 0 is an incomplete process, and the incomplete process provides risk to the organization. And you can see that I have performed process, I have a managed process, I have an established process, I have a predictable process, and I have an innovating process. So those process levels are then further broken down into what they call process attribute indicators. And you can see that there's 9 of them. And it starts out with level 1, PA11, which says process performance. So to get to level 1, you need to do all the base practices and all the work products. Okay? So that gets you level 1. And then to get to level 2 through 5, you need to look at what are called generic practices and generic work products. And to give you an example of that, we'll look at one in the next slide. But again, the important thing from this, the takeaway is we have our process dimension, we have our process reference model, and we have our capability dimension. And we're going to then use a rating to come up with some value later on. So let's look at one of the generic practices. Now, I actually took these ones because they sort of would be familiar to people if they were into Six Sigma. Because if you are a Six Sigma aficionado, then think DMAIC for the next few slides. This one is level 3, which, as we saw in the previous slide, is established level. So we have our definition, appropriate data collected and analyzed, but you look in the middle and it has our generic practice, 3.26, which collect and analyze data about performance of the process to demonstrate its suitability and effectiveness. So this sounds a lot to me like measure in the DMAIC model. The next thing we see is our generic work products. So we have our 4.0, which is our quality records. So we want these quality records. They should provide evidence or reviews undertaken for each instance of the process. So this concept of an instance. So when we're talking about quality records, we would have many instances or examples or copies of a quality record. If we're talking about a project management methodology, then we'd only have one instance, because if we had multiple project management methodologies, we would have a problem in our organization. You see the next generic work product is process performance records. So in order for this to work, we need quality records and we need process performance records. And if we could say yes, and we have that generic practice, then we can say we meet the requirements of process deployment. So this was our measure. The next one we have our analyze. It starts out with analyze measurement data of the process to identify real and potential variations in process performance. And 4.23 is analyze process and product measurement results to identify variations in process performance. So again, we have our process performance records. We see that we want to see that they've analyzed the measurements of the data that was collected, right? So this, again, level 4 is predictable level, right? So again, at predictable, we're going to start to do some quantitative process control. Further, at the predictable level, we have quantitative process control 4.25, which is identify and implement corrective actions to address assignable causes. So again, this becomes our improve of the DMAIC, right? So we read the last 3 slides, it looks a lot like a DMAIC model to me. And in fact, we talk about assignable causes. So again, that goes back to this concept that we have to have stable processes so we can look at common cause variation. Common cause variation is usually, we derive what that is by doing some sort of root cause analysis. Okay? So we're going to look for the problems. And then we're going to also update our process performance records to show that we made some improvement based on the data we collected and the analysis we did. So this is our example of the generic practices and the generic work products. And again, to achieve this level, you'd have to do these things, right? Now, when we talk about achieving this level, you would have had to achieve the level 1 through 3 to get to level 4. And to do that, you have to be rated somehow. So to get a level, you have to come up with a rating, and the way it works is it has to be largely achieved or fully achieved, and the previous one has to be fully achieved, the previous level. So if we're talking about level 1, then we obviously meet the requirements of level 0, but we need to be at least 50% or half-assed in our processing of doing this process, right? So we have to either largely achieve or fully achieve to get level 1. And so it's up to us to decide how we come up with 15% or 50%. There's some suggestions as we can look at the amount of artifacts that are required, the input, the output, the practices, add them all up, decide how many we did, and do an average and say, well, they did 50% of them, so we're going to give them largely achieved. Right? Or it could be you use your expertise to say, wow, this practice is a lot more important than these other practices, and if they don't do that, then they don't achieve the requirements. So again, it's really up to the expertise, and it's really up to what is decided when we do our initiation and planning phases. Now, in ISO 15504, you only got the table at the top. When they came out with 33002, they decided that a lot of people said, well, like partially achieve 15 to 50, that's a pretty wide range. And what's the difference between 50 and 51? Like that's pretty tough too. So they decided to break it down a bit. And you can see that I have partially achieved is now 15% negative, or dash is 15% to 32.5. As well, we have partially achieved, which is 32.5 to 50, and largely achieved negative is 50 to 67.5, and largely plus is 67.5 to 85. So I take these numbers, I go back to my levels, and I decide when I'm doing this, each one, I go to level 1 and I say, are they meeting all the base practices in the work products for all the process that we've decided to evaluate? Now, we don't have to do all the processes. We can decide to do just a subset of them, and that is part of, again, what we do when we start to do our assessment. So we look at level 1 and say, do they meet it? Now, again, you just need to get largely or fully, so 50% or higher, and you will get you will meet process performance attribute indicator. Now, to get to level 2, I have to fully meet, which is 85 and greater, level 1, and then I just need to be 50% level 2 kind of thing. To get to level 3, I have to be 100% or fully 1, fully 2, and then largely 3 or fully 3, and so on and so forth with 4 and 5. So you have to achieve fully the levels below you to move on to the next level. So this is not dissimilar to what you would see in the capability maturity model integrated, because this was based on, CMMI was based on the original standard of 15504. And so you'll see a lot of similarity in it. It's just come a little ways, especially when you look at what's on this slide here. We start to talk about, collecting and analyzing data about the performance of the process. We're getting more and more into quantitative assessment, especially here when we talk about quantitative process control, and you need to start gathering data, and that data needs to be analyzed to identify variations, right? So again, we talk about, we have our standard performance, we have our mean, we have our average, but we're going to see some variations around that average, and we have to decide what that is. And again, we look for the root cause of the common process performance issues. And then the results of the process control are analyzed to determine the issues of concern and forwarded for action. So we'll decide to work on some of the root causes. We can't work on them all, or common causes, they call them here. And then the next one, we implement our improvements. So it's a very quantitative method at some levels, and at other levels, it's just a matter of providing me artifacts and base practices to satisfy the standard. So that's how I come up with these ratings. And again, I do a rating for each process, and then I can give an overall rating. Now, when you talk about organizational maturity, then that is, I assess all the processes, and I give them capability ratings. So I could say they're all fully achieved. And then I could then talk about organizational maturity and say, well, since all the processes are fully achieved, then this organization has a high level of maturity with respect to project management. But I can't take these, every one of the process ones and say, oh, that shows the organization is mature. No, it just shows that they're capable in doing that process. So once we have all that, so we talked about that we had our PAM, our process assessment model, and our process assessment model was made up of a process reference model. We gave you multiple examples of a process reference model like COVID-5. You have TIPA, which is our Tudor ITSM process assessment. We also had enterprise process assessments. We had software development process assessment models. So we had a number of process assessment models. We looked at our process reference model, and again, we had our measurement framework. So our measurement framework comes from the standards, the ISO standards. They're not modified, but you do have some choices in there as to how you want to, whether you want two-dimensional or multi-dimensional ways of measuring the process capability. We've kept it simple here because this is a fairly easy area to assess, so we've kept it to a two-dimensional model, and the two dimensions being the process capability and the process reference model and the measurement framework. So once we have all that, our measurement framework, and we have some ratings, and we have a process reference model, we can start our assessment. Our assessment starts, it's fairly simple, is we do some initiation. So the initiation, we do some fact finding, we talk to the client, we talk to the process owner, we talk to the sponsor, we talk to various people. We get an idea of whether they want to do it for the whole organization, do they want to do it for a particular department, do they want to do it for a particular division, so what is the scope of the audit itself. We also at this point would like to know whether they're doing it for capability determination or whether they're doing it for process improvement, because that might slant the way we do the audit. Again, the assessment, I should say, not audit. So again, we start the assessment process. Then we get into planning. So one of the things in planning we do is we have to start doing our mapping, right? So again, as I said, you might not have the same names as are in ISO 21500. So we're going to map your process names to ISO 21500 so that we can continue to do our process assessment. And then we'll brief the people. The people that will be briefed are the sponsor, and maybe you're a large enough organization, you might have a coordinator. Generally, we like to have process owner or owners if there are more than one. In some organizations, we find that, and there are other participants that might be called to the table as well, and there might be other process professionals that are called. As well, we have our lead assessor. That's the person standing up and going through this and talking about this to the various people on this project steering committee here. And the assessors themselves are the ones sitting at the bottom of the table. And so they're going through the process and explaining all this and briefing the sponsor, the coordinator, process owner as to what is the process and explaining to them what they can expect at the back end and getting agreement. If you can't get agreement from the sponsor, then you stop because there's no point in continuing to go on. So once we've done our initiation, planning, and briefing, and again, all these are defined in the book that is shown there, but you can find them in COBIT and in TIPA as well, similar processes. But for each process, remember we have 45. We don't have to do all 45. If you want to do an overall assessment of project management, then yes, you'd have to look at 45 processes. But maybe you're only concerned about project governance. So you would just do the established and monitored processes. Or maybe you're just concerned with IT investments, so you'd only look at those ones, right? So you decide which processes, and for each process, we have to gather evidence on which to make our ratings, right? So we start out with collecting data, and once we collect the data, we validate it. Now, this shows it as serially, but as soon as we start collecting data, I can start validating it. So it doesn't mean I have to wait till I've collected all my data. By validation, I mean we go back to the process owner, we go back to other participants, we go back to the process professionals and say, we gathered this data. Is there any more data? Is this all you have? Do you have this? Do you have that? And you want to make sure that you've collected all the data that is available. Once we have got all the data, then we can do our analysis. And once we do our analysis, we can go back and do our process attribute rating. And remember, that was where we gave it a value from 0 to 100%. And you decide on how that ranking is going to be done. And you will talk about it in the briefing, and you will talk about it in the planning. And everybody's going to understand how you're going to derive that number. So at the end, there's no dispute to say, well, we decided up front that we were going to do it a percentage of the artifacts and base practices. And so I only got 50% of them, so I gave you 50% kind of thing. And we do that for each process as shown in that box. So if you do 45, you have to go through each one of them serially and do each one in turn. Once we've done all that, then we create a report. And in that report, we will show, remember going back to that diagram where we showed the assessment process, we have all the things that were shown in there. We say the name of the organization, the scope of it, who was involved, the owners, the sponsors. We give them the process attribute ratings. We talk about gaps. We talk about the seriousness of the gaps. And on the next slide, we can see some of the consequence of the capability gaps. So in the furthest left, you can see that there's our capability levels from perform process all the way up to innovating. I didn't put incomplete process because that would be the highest. But you can see that the seriousness of consequence goes down as we go up. So it's the highest when it's only perform, and it's the lowest when we have innovating. And you can see some nature of the consequence in the middle. But here's a more comprehensive list that came from the ISO 15504 and has been slightly modified to meet project management. So you can see at level 1, if we don't do that, we have missing work products and process outcomes are not achieved. So that's pretty serious. That poses risk to the organization. It has great consequence. At level 2.1, we get cost or time overruns. We get unclear responsibilities, uncontrolled decisions. Continuing at level 2, we get unpredictable product quality and integrity. We get uncontrolled versions. We get increased support costs. Going into process definition, level 3, we get identified best practice and lessons learned are not defined. No foundation for organization-wide process improvement, and so on and so forth until we come down to something not so bad at level 5. You say, process improvement objectives not clearly defined. We're doing the process, we're just not identifying the objectives. So opportunities for improvement not clearly identified, and we have the inability to change process effectively to achieve relevant process improvement objectives and inability. So if I was writing this report up, I'd say level 1, the problem is if you're a level 1, you don't do any of these things from 2 to 5, right? And you have missing work products and your process outcomes are not achieved, so that's fairly high consequence. Another way of stating that, though, is that we can take it and talk about it as a capability gaps and a risk. So again, we have our capability levels on the left from innovating process down to perform process. If we put level 0 in, then it would be high risk all the way across. So you can see probability indicated in the next 3 columns, probability indicated by extent of capability level gap. And you can see that if I have a slight gap at level 5, then it's low risk. Same with significant, same with substantial. So if I'm at level 5, then the risk to the organization is fairly low. If I have a predictable process, I'm only a level 4, then it becomes a medium risk when the gap is substantial. So that means I'm at 15%, 30% at level 4, then I'm at medium risk. At level 3, established level, you can see that slight is low risk, significant is medium risk, and same with substantial. Now, when we go to manage, you see that we have a medium risk, and a high risk, and perform medium risk, high risk, high risk. So this goes back to that diagram from SPICE, where we said we can do our capability determination that gives us some indication of risk with respect to the process. So here's a table you can use to say if you're only a level 1 and you have substantial gap, capability level gap, then you're at high risk with respect to this process. And if you do that for every one of your processes and they all come back as high risk, then you are at risk, obviously, as an organization. So this is basically where we came in. I tried to provide a simple review of our processes. Remember that they're inputs, activities, outputs, or base practices, and we do some measurement of the activities and the inputs, and we do some control of the activities and the inputs. And one of the things we have is our standards. Our standards provide our performance indicators, and we have our policy, which provides our outcomes and our objectives. So we have a simple process definition. And again, don't forget that we have some issues with respect to process capability. We have to make sure that our processes are stable. We cannot do a capability assessment of an unstable process, so we have to bring it so that the only variation we have is a common cause variation, that we can determine what is the root cause of that common cause variation. So we're going to do a capability assessment. So our capability assessment involves a process assessment model. Thinking back to the beginning, our process assessment model was broken into a measurement framework and a process reference model. There are various process reference models, as I pointed out, from COBIT to TIPA to the one I demonstrated here and shown on this page, and there is also one for enterprise processes as well. So you develop a process reference model. So I probably didn't emphasize this enough at the beginning, but the only difference between, say, a COBIT 5 assessor and a project management capability assessment assessor is that they have subject matter expertise with respect to the process reference model. All the other levels, the process assessment is exactly the same. You know, it's level 2 to 5. It's the same. I don't care if we're talking about TIPA, we're talking about COVID, or we're talking about ISO 21500. Where it becomes different is at level 1, where we have a process reference model. So I need to have expertise within that process reference model to do the assessment. So again, we have our process reference model and we have a measurement framework. Our measurement framework, remember, we had capability levels from 0 to 5, and we had process attribute indicators. There was 9 of them starting at level 1. So we had 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. And so those were our process attributes. And then for those, we're going to look at our generic practices and our generic work products. At level 1, we look at base practices and our base work products. So those give us our process assessment model. And then the last thing I showed you was how to do an assessment, a fairly straightforward methodology, like, you know, it could be based on ISO 19011, any methodology you want, really not important. We've given you one in this book that's shown here, but you might develop your own. So that is what I wanted to show you today. I probably left more questions unanswered than provided. This is a fairly simple thing once you get into it, but to describe it in an hour is not easy. So that was my attempt.
Thank you, Peter, for this great presentation. Before we proceed with the Q&A session, I would like to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services on a wide range of ISO standards, including ISO 9001, ISO 27001, ISO 22301, and many more. A PCB certificate on these courses will demonstrate your dedication in implementing and managing processes and frameworks in the industry that you work in, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions regarding today's session. The first question is, how can this be used to assess a company's process to determine the quality of services rendered to their clients? A reference standard is 9001, though the company is not certified yet.
So, as I tried to point out here, you need to have a process reference model. And since you're talking about, I guess, outsourcing, its provision of third-party services sort of thing, there are a number of potential process reference model for you. The Software Engineering Institute has one called e-sourcing capability process. So there are a number of them. You'll find that there's a number of maturity models out there. What you need to do is to have a process reference model for whatever area you're dealing with. And then it's simple. The rest is you just use the ISO standards, 33002, 33020, 33071, and do your assessment. So the hardest part is to come up with a process reference model. As you saw, I pointed out that they're developing one for ISO 27001. Yes, you had a standard, but 27001 just doesn't come out, and the processes just don't jump out the page at you. You have to sort of take them out of ISO 27002, which is a code of practice, and develop some processes from that. But that's the hardest part you're going to have, is develop that process reference model. Then the rest of it's easy.
Thank you, Peter.
I don't know if that's where what the question was, but that's what I thought it was.
Yeah, I believe so. The second question is how to exploit the relationship between Six Sigma and quality management systems. So basically, which guidelines to combine and integrate in a systematic way so that we can get the maximum of their capabilities.
Sure. So in Six Sigma, we talk about that before we can determine the capability of a process, we have to make it stable. So that's basically what you're trying to do at level 1, is to determine that you have a stable process and that you're doing all the things that would be required of, say, in my example, project management. So once you've done that, then you can start to look at improving it. And once we start to look for improvement, then we start to look at tools and techniques for improvement. And you saw in those 3 slides I popped up, they start talking about quantitative methodologies, and they talk about measure, analyze, and improve. So that leads you to a DMAIC framework. So at that point, I would bring in the Six Sigma toolkit. Now, the problem when we talk about Six Sigma is that people use it for different reasons. They talk about it as a sort of an ethos. They talk about it as an architecture, and they talk about it as a toolkit. So in this case, we would use the toolkit to satisfy ourselves at level 4 and level 3 that we're doing an adequate job.
Thank you, Peter. Now, to conclude the presentation, I would like to touch a little bit on the review that ISO makes to the ISO standards. Can you please say some words about the review that every standard has in the ISO industry, like every 5 years? Some of the audience is interested in knowing more on that.
So there is a review cycle, and you could go into each one of the technical committees and see what the review cycle is. They tend to make it within 5 years. Sometimes it's not always 5 years. As I said, the previous version of ISO 21500 was 2012. They're now working on completing the newest version. I don't know if that was because they were waiting for PMBOK version 6 to be completed and see what was in that so they can make it align it with that, because they previously aligned 21500 with version 3 of the PMBOK. So maybe that's why this one has been a little bit late. But yes, there is a review cycle. Again, because these are standards, there's nothing, we come up with new thoughts around these areas, but there's not technical detail in them except for things like code of practices and things like that, which should be updated on a more frequent basis. But when we talk about, an information security management system, well, the information security management system really hasn't changed. What has changed is the tools and techniques we use within our information security program. Right?
Thank you, Peter, once again for this great session, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.